So hello all. So in continuation with the exception chapter, we will learn in detail about exception propagation. So what is this exception propagation? We will learn in detail. So mostly the exceptions are raised in the either in declare section or in the executable section or in the exception section. So those must be handled. So if the exception is raised in the executable section, those exceptions are handled using inner or outer blocks. In the previous videos, we had covered the exceptions which are occurred into the executable section. So I hope you have gone through the previous videos. If you have not watched our previous videos, please do watch our previous video. You will get the link in the description box. So if the exceptions are raising in the executable section, that is inside the begin and end block, then those can be handled in the outer and inner block. So I will explain in detail about inner and outer block with the block of code. Whereas next, if the exceptions are raised in the declare section or exception section, those must be handled by using outer blocks only. So let's move in detail. So first we will try to prove this statement, that is when the exception is raised in the executable section. So if at all the exceptions are raised in the executable section, that is inside the begin and end block, those should be handled in the inner or outer blocks. So let's work on the inner and outer blocks. So you can see here, this is the inner block. So outer block, so begin, this is starting from here and end it ending over here. Now outside the inner block, I have added the declare section in which I have added variable, or I have declared the variable of varchar2 size 3, and this variable will be applicable inside the inner block as well as outside the inner block, that is outer block. So this will be the globally valid. Now inside the inner block begin section, inside the begin section there is one more begin section which is inner block. A value I am assigning as a b c d, which is of size more than 3. So I have declared the size of A as 3, but in the executable section, I am assigning the value of A which is size greater than 3, that is 4. So this will be the exception. If this exception is raised, it will be directly search for the exception in the inner block first. So let us uncomment this part. So I have commented the exception which is present in the inner block. So if the exception are raised into the executable section, that is inside the begin and end block, first it will search for the exception inside the inner block only. Now it will search for the exception. Yes, the exception is present, and this type of exception is called as value error. So when value error, then print this statement. So the printed statement or the exception will be handled by the inner block. So that's why I have printed the statement as handled by the inner block. It will not move to the exception which is present in the outer block. First, it will search for the exception which is present in the inner block. And if at all this exception is not present in the inner block, then it will move to the outer block. So first we will try to execute this query. Now you will observe that exception which is present in the outer block, I have written the statement as handled by the outer block. Now let's see which exception is fired. So if I execute this block of code, you will see output as handled by the inner block. So it is handled by the inner block. You will see the exception which is present inside the inner block. So this exception is fired. Now let's comment the exception which is present in the inner block. So I am commenting this exception. Now let's see what happens. Now when the error is taking place inside the begin and out block, that is this executable section, first it will search for the exception in the inner block. If the exception is not present in the inner block, it will search for the outer block exception. Yes, in the outer block the exception is present and it will fire this statement, that is handled by the outer block. So if I execute the full block of code, you will see the output as handled by the outer block. So like this, if the exception is raised in the executable section, those exceptions can be either handled by the inner exception or inner block or the outer block. So I hope this part is pretty much clear. So we have proved the statement number 1. Now let's see the statement number 2. Whereas if exceptions are raised in the declare section or in the exception section, those are handled by outer blocks only. So let's try to execute this block. So this outer block section you will see here. So this is my inner block, and you will see this is the outer block is this, that is begin, declare and exception. So this is the outer block. Now see what is the exception. So in the declare section I have declared the variable a of size 3, and I have assigned the size of a as abcd, which is of size 4. Means the exception will raise at the declare section only. Now, if at all the exceptions are raised at the declare section, the control will not move into the inner block. It will directly search the exception in the outer block itself. So if the exception is raised at this line number, let me use the line number. Yes. If the exception is raised at the 324 line number, it will shift to the 332 exception. That is the outer block. So this is an inner block. In inner block there is one more exception, but this exception will not fire, because if exceptions are raised either in declare section or in the exception section, this should be handled by the outer block only. So let's try to execute the code. Now you will see here, as the exception is raised in the declare section, it will directly switch to the outer block exception, that is handled by the outer block exception will be fired. So if I run this block of code, you will see the output as handled by the outer block. Now let's do one thing. Let's comment the exception from the outer block. So let's comment this part. Now what I am doing here, I am commenting the exception from the outer block. So exception which is present, handling of exception which is done in the outer block, I am commenting this. Means let's see whether it is handled by the inner block or not. If at all the exception is raised at the declare section, let's see whether the control is moving in the exception which is present in the inner block or not. So if I run this code, you will see that directly the error will come. So the error is not handled. So that is numeric or value error. That is character string buffer too small. So hence we can conclude that exceptions which are raised into this declare section, that is outer block, then those are compulsory handled by the outer block only. You can see the exception I have written in the inner block, but it is not firing or the control is not coming into this exception which is present in the inner block. So likewise, the exceptions are handled by the outer block itself. So I hope this part is pretty much clear regarding the exception propagation. So we'll meet in the next video. In the next video, we'll try to cover the user defined exception. So if you found this information pretty well, please do subscribe and press the bell icon and share with your friends. So all the material associated with this blog or all the lectures will be available in the description box. So that's all for this video. So we'll meet in the next video. Thank you and have a wonderful day ahead.